Halloween at Joe's Pumpkin Farm. It was a bright, cool day in late October, and the Miller family was getting ready to visit Joe's pumpkin farm. This was their favorite Halloween tradition. Every year, they would visit the farm, pick out the best pumpkins, and enjoy the day with Joe's family, who had owned the farm for years. Megan, who was 9 years old, was especially excited. She loved pumpkins and everything about Halloween. Her little brother, Jake, who was 5, loved it too. But he was more interested in the farm animals. He couldn't wait to see Joe's friendly dog, Rusty, and the chickens.
Are you ready for the pumpkin farm?
Mrs. Miller asked as she packed snacks into a basket.
Yes.
Megan and Jake said at the same time. They had been talking about this trip all week. Mr. Miller grabbed the car keys, and the whole family piled into the car. The drive to the farm was peaceful, with the fall leaves falling gently from the trees and the cool breeze coming through the windows. When they arrived at Joe's pumpkin farm, they saw Joe's family waiting for them. Joe was an older man with a warm smile, and his wife, Mary, was standing next to him, waving. Their son, Ben, who was around Megan's age, was helping to set up a table full of hot chocolate and apple cider.
Welcome, Millers.
Joe called out as they stepped out of the car.
Are you ready to pick some pumpkins?
We sure are.
Mr. Miller replied. Megan and Jake ran ahead to see the pumpkins, while their parents chatted with Joe and Mary. Joe's pumpkin patch was famous in their town. There were pumpkins of all shapes and sizes, big, small, round, and even some with funny bumps. Megan loved wandering through the rows, looking for the perfect one.
I'm going to find the biggest pumpkin this year,
Megan said to Ben as they walked through the patch together. Ben smiled.
I think you can do it, but don't forget sometimes the best pumpkins aren't the biggest ones.
Megan looked at him, confused.
What do you mean?
Ben pointed to a small pumpkin nearby.
See this one, it's small, but it's got the perfect shape for carving. It's not always about the size.
Megan thought about this and smiled.
You're right, I'll keep that in mind.
As Megan searched the rows of pumpkins, she saw so many different kinds, some tall and skinny, some small and perfectly round. One pumpkin had a funny shape that made her giggle.
Look, Ben, this one looks like it's smiling,
she said, pointing to a bumpy, squashed pumpkin. Ben laughed.
It does look funny. Maybe Jake would like that one.
Megan nodded, thinking about her little brother.
Yeah, he'd probably make a silly face on it.
Over by the animals, Jake was having a great time with Rusty, Joe's friendly dog. Rusty was running around the barn, barking happily as Jake chased after him.
Rusty, come back!
Jake shouted with a big grin on his face. Mary, Joe's wife, smiled as she watched them.
Jake loves Rusty, doesn't he?
She said to Mrs. Miller.
Oh, yes.
Mrs. Miller replied, laughing.
Jake talks about Rusty all year long. Every time we say we're going to the pumpkin farm, Rusty is all he can think about.
Mary chuckled.
Well, Rusty loves the company. He's always happy when the farm is full of families.
After playing with Rusty, Jake wandered over to the chicken coop where Mary was feeding the chickens.
Would you like to help me feed the chickens, Jake?
She asked kindly. Jake's eyes lit up.
Yes, please.
Mary handed him a small cup of feed, and Jake carefully threw it onto the ground. The chickens clucked and pecked at the grains, making Jake laugh.
They're so funny.
Jake said, watching the chickens scurry around. Megan, meanwhile, had finally chosen her pumpkin. It wasn't the biggest one, but it was perfectly round and smooth. She couldn't wait to take it home and carve it into a spooky jack-o'-lantern.
Look what I found.
Megan said proudly, showing her pumpkin to her parents.
That's a great one.
Mr. Miller said, admiring it. Jake, too, had found a small, round pumpkin, and he was excited to take it home.
I'm going to carve a happy face on mine.
He said.
Good choice, Jake.
Mrs. Miller said with a smile.
That pumpkin will make a great jack-o'-lantern.
As they carried their pumpkins back to the table where Joe and Mary were serving hot chocolate, the smell of warm apple cider filled the air. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden glow over the pumpkin patch, and the cool breeze made the hot drinks even more comforting. Megan and Jake sat down with their parents and sipped their hot chocolate, feeling happy and content.
I love coming here every year.
Megan said quietly, looking around at the pumpkins and the people enjoying the farm.
Me too.
Jake said, slurping his drink.
The pumpkins, the animals, the hot chocolate, it's all my favorite.
As they sat together, Joe came over and joined them at the table.
So, did you find the perfect pumpkins this year?
He asked with a smile.
We did.
Megan said, holding up her pumpkin.
I can't wait to carve it.
Good to hear.
Joe said.
You know, when I was your age, I used to come out to this same field with my dad to pick pumpkins. We didn't have as many back then, but it was still my favorite part of Halloween.
Do you still carve pumpkins?
Megan asked curiously. Joe laughed.
Oh, I do, but I'm not as good at it as I used to be. I leave most of the carving to Ben these days.
Ben, who had been helping another family, came over and smiled.
Yeah, I like carving pumpkins. I'm thinking of making a funny face on mine this year.
What about you, Megan? What are you going to carve?
Joe asked. Megan thought for a moment.
Maybe a cat.
She said.
A spooky cat with big eyes.
That sounds great.
Joe said.
And Jake, what about you?
I'm going to make a happy face.
Jake said proudly, holding up his little pumpkin. Joe chuckled.
That sounds perfect. We'll have all kinds of faces this year.
As the evening went on, the families talked and laughed, sharing stories about past Halloweens and their favorite memories at the farm.
This place is special,
Mrs. Miller said.
It's not just about the pumpkins. It's about the time we spend together.
Joe nodded in agreement.
That's exactly how we feel. It's about more than just the farm. It's about the community, the families, and the memories we make together.
As the sky turned a deep orange and pink, signaling the end of the day, the Millers and Joe's family began packing up. Megan and Jake carefully placed their pumpkins in the back of the car, excited to take them home and carve them the next day. Before they left, Megan turned to Ben and smiled.
Thanks for helping me pick out my pumpkin. I'll never forget today.
Ben smiled back.
I'm glad you found the perfect one. See you next year.
As they waved goodbye and drove home, Megan looked out the window at the setting sun and the rows of pumpkins disappearing in the distance. She felt a warmth in her heart, knowing that this wasn't just about picking pumpkins, it was about spending time with her family, laughing, and enjoying the simple joys of life. Halloween wasn't just about spooky costumes and candy. For Megan and Jake, it was about making memories with the people they loved. And they knew that every year, they would come back to Joe's pumpkin farm, ready to make more memories that they would treasure forever.